webinar series, and you may already have been with us for previous sessions on the series. It's a series that started in October 2020, and it's part of the multidisciplinary and transnational project on Thanatic ethics, the circulation of bodies in migratory spaces. And it's a project that is funded by the Education University of Hong Kong through Bedisha Banerjee in partnership with La Maison Française d'Oxford in Oxford through Thomas Lacroix, who is here as well, and the Research Center Emma at the Université Paul Valéry Montpellier 3 through myself. So there is a website for you to know more about the events, flesh and blood, events, physical events on campus that should be organized in the next few months. And you can write to us as well to be put on the mailing list. So this talk, as you have seen, will be recorded. So if you don't want to appear on the screen, just switch your cameras off and make sure you have your muted mics as well. And I'm sure you'll have questions also and comments at the end of the talk. So the sessions generally last an hour, but often get extended a little bit. So if you could put your questions on in the chat, it would help monitoring time and speech so that benefit is shared by all. So today we are delighted to welcome Valérie Loichot. So as most of you will know, she's professor at Emory University, and she travels between, across, and with literatures in French and in English. I will not say French literatures or English literatures, with a strong focus on the Francophone and the Anglophone Caribbean and the US South. So of course she's well known for many articles and her edited volume as well on Édouard Glissant. Valérie is particularly renowned as well for her books, orphan narratives on post-plantation literatures, and The Tropics Bite Back, Culinary Coup in Caribbean Literature, such a wonderful title. And more recently, Water Graves. And Water Graves brings together poetry, mixed media art, underwater sculptures, produced in the Caribbean and in the US Gulf Coast to explore artistic and aesthetic ways of memorializing the drowned in the aftermath of the Middle Passage and of Katrina, but more importantly, of situating, in fact, the present-day migrations in the aftermath of slavery, forced transportation and massacres, and addressing what Valérie calls the unritual. So she will, tell us more about that. Just the personal, touch in the introduction. Valérie's style of thinking, writing, and interpreting the world is quite unique. And I think I can single it out among, many. I always look forward to what she's going to write next. And so for the moment, we're very much looking forward to listening to her. So thank you, Valérie, for having accepted our invitation. We are delighted and honored. So floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Judith, for this more than generous and moving introduction. It's been really nice knowing you and exchanging ideas for the past, I think about 15 years now. So, so it's nice to reconvene again here today. So as Professor Mizrahi Barak said, this intervention is a return to my book, Water Graves, which was published just about 1 year ago, with today a special focus on sculpture, which I find particularly fitting for the Thanatic Ethics Research Group convened by the Center for Popular Culture in the Humanities at the University of Hong Kong, Emma at the Université Paul Valéry in Montpellier, and the Maison Française of Oxford University. I'm grateful and honored to speak to such a transnational and distinguished group today I was happy to recognize some names amongst the spectators today, and I thank you for the invitation, and I would like to thank particularly Judith, Bidisha, and Thomas. Ai Weiwei's arrangement of human bones remains the emblematic photograph of this thinking group, as well as a sentence in this group's mission statement, and I quote your mission statement: "We may wonder what happens to these bodies, what happens to these bones. Are they repatriated back to the homeland? If not, are they, in a cruel twist of fate, simply buried in mass graves on the foreign shores they tragically failed to reach while alive?" The poster and statement convinced me to choose sculpture today amongst the multiple media I investigate in water graves. Due to its three-dimensionality, tangibility, and hardness, it's the best medium to provide an ersatz for missing bones in the aftermath of what I call unritual. Unritual is the privation of ritual. As I define it in the book, unritual is a state more absolute even than desecration or defilement, since the latter imply the existence of a previous sacred state or object, a temple, a grave, a ceremonial. Unritual, the steering concept of water graves, is the obstruction of the sacred in the first place. Anthropological paleontologists mark the first burials as the threshold of humanity. In Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, philosopher René Girard proposes that the tomb, I quote, is the starting point of the constitutive displacement of culture. Quite a number of fine minds think that it is literally true on the level of human history as a whole. Funerary rituals, he concludes, could well amount to the first actions of a strictly cultural type. Following Girard's logic, the stripping of rituals is a fundamental attempt to uncouple humans from their humanity. Through the prefix un, referring to absence or undoing, I consciously linked unritual paradigmatically with the word undead. The unritual and the undead dwell in a state of limbo between life and death, where those gone without appropriate rituals persist in living amongst and haunting the living. Victims of the unritual are akin to zombie figures roaming in the texts and works featured in water graves. I use the Haitian Creole spelling of zombie instead of the Americanized, Hollywoodized zombie, since the Haitian spelling conserves the liminal figure state of dehumanization, of deontologization produced by enslavement. The Haitian and Caribbean, more generally, zombie has a body, a shell, a carcass, stripped from her or his soul and being. And then there is water. I return to the Thanatic ethics main statement. Are these bones simply buried in mass graves on the foreign shores they tragically failed to reach while alive? But what happens to the bones, we should add, when they are underwater? Bones are nowhere to be found, but also potentially everywhere, thus creating an enormous loss and haunting, an enormous absence and a throbbing presence, which Martinican poet and philosopher Édouard Glissant featured in his inaugural essay of Poétique de la Relation, La Barque Ouverte, or The Open Boat. In that text, Glissant reads the corroded weights attached to the enslaved humans as an underwater text punctuating the bottom of the sea, constituting, I quote him, an enormous beginning, an énorme commencement, which can never be processed out of the abysmal belly of the sea. And I will read the quote in French for those of you who need the translation. The English translation is on your slide. Ainsi, toute navigation sur la splendeur verte d'océan suggère-t-elle avec une évidence d'algues, c'est bas-fond, c'est profond, ponctué de boulets qui rouillent à peine. Note what is missing from the text, human bones. Human bones do not even resurface as symptoms in the text. The bones are missing. Human bodies are missing. Only ballast and sunken instruments of torture, the corroded bolts and chains, manifest their haunting in the present of those navigating the Atlantic and of those reading the text. There are no bones. I want the bones. These were the two epigraphs on the first slide of this PowerPoint presentation. And these are urges from poet Nourbese Philip, who cries out in the notanda following her poem Zong, these two urgent needs. There are no bones and I want the bones. The poet lawyer from Trinidad and Tobago ponders, does it mean, and I'm quoting Philip, does it mean that unlike being interred, once you're underwater, there's no retrieval? The gravestone or tombstone marks the spot of interment, whether of ashes or of the body. What marks the subaquatic death? Unquote. This talk from a book focuses on the three-dimensional, the hard, the tangible. In the ultimate loss of bones, what the artist can best bring to the unritual is the sculptural. However, it is not as simple as this for that. Water and ritual renders impossible any functioning exchange of currency, whether emotional or memorial. Water and ritual, I will show, creates a paradox in the practice of sculpture. The works of sculptors like Jason deCaires Taylor become unpredictably nebulous. The intangible words of poets like Nourbese Philip become hard as rock, as if to show the impossibility of unearthing or unaquaing, I'm coming back to this term later, the memory of those departed, and simultaneously the impossibility of not doing it. I focus today on this life-creating paradox of liquescent sculptures and bone water. So I come to my first section, liquescent sculptures. We have to begin with what water grave sculptures is not before understanding what it is, with a detour through Hegel, who defines sculpture as the ideal art form, or as he calls it, temple of the mind. I quote Hegel on art, religion, and philosophy here. The spirit which sculpture represents is that which is solid in itself, not broken up in the play of trivialities and passions, unquote. The response to Hegel, the challenges to rigidity, didactic function, authoritarianism, and spectator passivity, which scholar James Young has highlighted on his work on counter monuments in the aftermath of the Shoah, are also particularly helpful in understanding the post-slavery art of the Caribbean, which similarly represents a painful and incomplete memory of a partially disappeared people. Like post-Shoah counter monuments, memory art produced in the aftermath of the Ma'afa or Middle Passage needs, and I quote James Young, brazen, painfully self-conscious memorial spaces conceived to challenge the very premises of their being, unquote. Jason deCaires Taylor's art enables alliances between the human drowned, underwater roots and growth and the sacred. His sculptures installed underwater across the oceans recreate structures friendly to the regeneration of species, threatened by human alteration of the environment, by providing long-lasting supports for coral regrowth, fish, sponges, crustacean, and other microscopic organisms. His official website includes the encyclopedic environment rubric, in which are listed the inhabitants of the shallows, lobsters, hermit crabs, shrimp, starfish, coral, sponges, etc., and the alliance they form with the anthropomorphic and non-anthropomorphic sculptures. Photographs of these symbiotic relations, creating a new habitat for the living from statues evoking underwater death, permeate his website. To take but one example, and this is your illustration, the head of a drowned woman detailed from Silent Evolution, which might have once appeared cadaveric with her empty eye sockets, is now bursting with life of multicolored sea moss and a white sea egg, which adorns her chest like a decoration or an ambivalently erotic prickly caress. Taylor's sculptures are both meant to evolve and to eventually disappear. They are works of creative vulnerability, of life enduring precisely thanks to its transient and relinquishing nature. They reach power through frailty. They demand intervention and cooperation, whether through human or choral signatures. Taylor's website provides multiple examples of this beauty reaching full bloom, precisely when it changes through ecological alliances. The statues in Taylor's Underwater Museum, or Musa in Isla Mujeres in Cancun, Mexico, are meant to be overtaken by coral within only a few years. And you can see some of this evolution on the juxtaposition of these two slides. Taylor's sunken community concretizes Glissant's theoretical claim that our landscape, I quote Glissant, is its own monument. Not only do landscapes constitute monuments, but more crucially, monuments revert into landscape in an unbroken continuum of living memorialization. Thus, Taylor's and nature's relational ensembles can also become unremarkably gray, formless, and ultimately indiscernible as works of art. Thus, Taylor relinquishes not only his statues, but also his very aesthetic gesture, which can become secondary or even instrumental to his ecological goal. As scholar James Buxton concludes, Taylor's underwater society will be eventually, I quote, totally assimilated by marine life, transformed to another state, a challenging metaphor for the future of our own species, unquote. This is a lesson for humanity, that after asserting a monumental strength, we have to relinquish the primacy of our species. The recognition of humans, of our own damage onto land and ocean, must come with the realization of the planetary impact of our own industrial and colonizing hubris. It is through trembling, the ephemeral, vulnerability, that we can survive in relation, to use Glissant's concept. Coral life is particularly apt to perform a durable ephemerality through its relational properties. Its worldwide presence in shallow tropical waters provides an apt example of submarine relations between vulnerable zones in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Dying coral reefs are screaming evidence for the urgency of preserving life on the planet as we know it. Indeed, about 60% of the world's reefs are at risk due to human-related activities. It would be ludicrous to see initiatives such as Taylor's as a practical solution to reconstruct quickly disappearing reefs on the planet. However, we can hope that his art may increase the visibility of their endangerment. In the book, I mean, there's much more to say about coral, and in the book, I delve at length to the use of a coral aesthetic by Mauritian poet Khaled Tourabouly in what he calls coral imaginary, and I invite you to read the details in the pre-circulated chapter where Tourabouly talks about the properties of coral as being hybrid and liminal, symbiotic, and also beautiful. So just going fast here. One of the lessons of Taylor's practice is that sculpture paradoxically needs to be fluid in order to provide effective forms of remembrance and reverence. The next installment of this talk, focusing on Trinidad and Tobago and Canada poet Nourbese Philip, seems to contradict this conclusion. More than with incongruity, though, we are faced with chiasm. Just as rocks must become liquid, impalpable words must become concrete. It's precisely this encounter of the fluid and the solid, of the permanent and the vulnerable, and of the tomb and the wake that provides the most vulnerable aesthetic tribute in the face of the unritual. And I arrive at my second section, bone water. Words can act as a pale yet vital substitute for the hardness of lost bones. Philip claims that the concrete solidity of her 2008 poem, Zong, memorializes those departed without national or personal monuments. Philip explains, I quote, "I use the text of the legal report almost as a painter uses paint or the sculptor uses stone." The raw material of Philip's poem comes from the world of law. It is the court transcript that ultimately condemned the slave traders who threw overboard approximately 140 African captives in order to collect insurance money, thus turning humans into jetsam. While moved by law, the trial does not do justice since it incriminates the traders not for their inhuman crime of killing human beings, but for having fooled the insurers. The verdict sanctions not the crime against humanity, but the financial fraud and swindling. And I'm quoting from the Gregson versus Gilbert case. It has been decided, whether wisely or unwisely, is not now the question, that a portion of our fellow creatures may become the subject of property. So this is wisely or unwisely. It's not our job to decide this now. This, therefore, was a throwing overboard of goods, concludes the verdict. It's a question for Philip to create some love, justice, reparation, or ritual in a situation of absolute unritual in which the law itself offers no recognition of the African victim's humanity. The drowned humans are locked up in a status of movable goods that forecloses legally and sacredly any mourning within the context of the law. The law itself, Philip argues, and I quote, "In its potent ability to degree that what is not, as in humans ceasing to be and becoming an object, a thing or chattel, the law approaches the realm of magic and religion. The conversion of human into chattel becomes an act of faulty transubstantiation, the equal of the metamorphosis of the Eucharist bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ," unquote. While the Eucharist converts quotidian staples such as bread into sacred substances, the transubstantiation operated by law has the opposite effect. It turns sacred human lives into commodities. If the law governing the enslavement of humans gains a magic and sacred aura, to believe Philip, it's a malevolent one. As herself both a lawyer and a poet, Philip must rectify the law, reverse the sense of transubstantiation by giving humanity and sacred back to the victims of the legalized and ritual through her practice of poetic creation. Poetry, poiesis as act of making, relays a faulty, even criminal law. While it is possible, albeit extremely difficult, to recover bones from a mass grave in Bosnia, Philip explains, retrieving bones from ocean floors and abysses is unachievable. Language itself fails in describing what such a retrieval would look like. Philip dismisses exhuming, the verb to exhume, as an appropriate word. Indeed, exhuming comes from ex-humus, out of the soil. From this linguistic void, she coins the term ex aqua. And you have the quote right here with, along with the first page of the Zong poem. What is the word for bringing black bodies? What is the word for bringing back bodies? And we could also read black bodies from water, from a liquid grave. I found words like resurrect and subaquatic, but not ex aqua. Does this mean that unlike being interred, once you're underwater, there is no retrieval, that you can never be exhumed from water? And I'll let you read the end. If we conceive of the poem as retrieving bones and reconstructing evidence, it will need to adapt its forensics to the particular conditions of an oceanic search. The incommensurable fathoms and width of the seas, the constant mobility of waves and currents, the movable sediments, and the disintegrating properties of salt water. Thus, the poem itself will be adaptable, mobile, floating, yet resting on the random flotsam and jetsam left behind by shipwrecks and the murder of humans thrown overboard. And on this point and the point of the wake, I encourage all of you to read Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, which is really a fantastic and indispensable book. The poem brings back meaning into the chaos that it exaquas by associating a hard poetics of bones with a liquid aesthetics of water. Not surprisingly then, Philip's book Zong is composed of disparate yet complementary items: the spine and cover, the front matter, some dedications, several epigraphs, the acknowledgement, 6 sections of the poem per se, a glossary, a manifest, a notanda, and the 1783 Gregson versus Gilbert court transcript. They are all presented on the same plane, hierarchically unmarked, not unlike Ai Weiwei's Remains, the poems complementing a legal document, which complements a linguistic glossary, which complements an essay in critical theory, notanda, and vice versa. On all the pages of the poems constituting the section called Os or OS, names of drowned Africans are listed below the bottom margin. You can see some of this happening also on the first page of the Zong. So there is the poem, then there is a dividing or unifying line, I don't know, I think both at once. And then you have names of drowned Africans that are listed at the bottom of the page. So Philip connects the underwater realm to the above water. Graphically, a divining or joining line marks the horizon between an above and a below, between the present of the poet and readers and the past of the departed. The line connects, and I quote Philip in her notanda, those who have died but continue to work on behalf of the living, unquote. The line is also the sacred Kalunga line of the Dikanga or Congo cosmogram, which represents a permeable border between the realms of the living and the dead. The relation between the aforementioned sections is not only successive, but also intrinsic. Indeed, the poem per se is built entirely of words, syllables, or letters found in the 2-page court transcript, at times becoming meaningful, at times nonsensical. Glissant in his works increasingly calls the poem or poetry, poétrie in French, to refer simultaneously to the aesthetic value of language, but also to the act of poiesis, of making. Poétrie in French phonetically evokes poterie or pottery, and pétrir, to knead, as if one needs bread. Poetry is thus an aesthetic gesture steeped in staple materiality. Like Glissant's poetry as pottery, Philip sculpts matter, the dough of the court case into sounds, words, and phrases, forming new assemblages. She explains her method, or her experience. The text The reported case is a matrix, a mother document. I devise a dictionary with a list of each of the mother words, followed by the words contained in that particular word. For instance, apprehension yields hen, Zion, pare, and pair, to list a few possibilities. I think of these poems as the flesh. The earlier 26 poems are the bones. Unquote. She brings the monolingual English words of the case into a Babel multilingualism of Arabic, Dutch, Fon, French, Greek, Hebrew, Italian, Latin, Portuguese, Spanish, Shona, Twi, West African Patois, and Yoruba. Beyond this linguistic diversity, letters form elementary pre-linguistic sounds, I quote, grunts, plosives. Is this perhaps, she asks, how language might have sounded at the beginning of time? To take one example, the first page of the poem, I don't know how clear it is, but you can read some of those, resembles the white beach of a page where shards of words, letters, lost languages have scattered like pieces of a shipwreck, and we can read among others, etc. So we can read all these sounds, guttural and stuttering, in really all the pages of the poem. Philip calls it a language of the grunt and groan, of moan and stutter, this language of pure sound, fragmented and broken by history. Paradoxically, this breaking up of language to its pre-human sounds marks the emergence of a poem written under the mark of the sacred by Philip and her co-author. You can read the co-author's name on the book cover, and the co-author's name is also on the spine of the book. So Zong M. Nourbese Philip, as told to the author by Sete Adamu Boateng. And Sete Adamu Boateng is the hallowed voice of the drowned ancestors. I talk about this more in the chapter that I pre-circulated, so you're welcome to go back to it. I have titled this section Bone Water and not Water Bone, which would simply refer to a bone situated in water. Bone water is an impossible yet unavoidable oxymoron. The cover illustration of the 2008 Wesleyan paperback, John McElnan design, juxtaposes the grayscale image of sea waves interrupted in its center by a tibia bone and its fibula, themselves interrupted by a blood-red circle in its center with a Gyenyame, a West African Adinkra spirit symbol. The Gyenyame, Caribbean scholar Tanya Shields explains, means, I quote, except for God. And situated on the only bit of color on the cover, the symbol looks ossified as well. Thus, from its visual beginning, Philip's text captures the idea of bodies, bones, and the spirit, unquote. The illustration is abstract enough, the fluid, the circle, the almost straight vertical, the gray and the red, that the reader can hold the book in her hands without perceiving the objects of its composition. While a bone should be more solid than water, the effect of transparency and marriage of textures of the image makes the one flow into the other. Before even the text begins, we already behold our bone water. The title of the first section of the poem per se is os, O-S. While os could be in Latin, it could also be a French word, os, meaning bones or bone. In its plural form, os could be pronounced os or o, and thus homonymous with o, water or waters. The necessary oxymoron is then also present in the section title. The shin bone on the cover is as gigantic as water, thereby implying that bones take as much space as water in our imagination of the drowned. The quest for bones is ubiquitous in water death or in mass graves. Bones are iconic in shields, bodies, and bones, in which she explains the bones of the enslaved Africans at the bottom of the Atlantic constantly caused me to consider the lack of value placed on and in Black lives. Bones are everywhere. The cover image of the Zong, as well as the disjointed words and syllables composing the poem per se, present these bygone skeletal structures as shards of fragmented bodies. These fragments lying around, like in Ai Weiwei's remains, can be seen as the passive state resulting from the literal cutting up and objectification of humans under the action of slave traders and callous governments. However, the slashing of the legal case transcript is first and foremost for Philip, a subjective act of revenge and justice. One approach, Philip explains, and I quote, was literally to cut up the text and just pick up words randomly, most similar to the activity of random picking of African slaves, selected randomly, then thrown together, hoping that something would come out of it, that they would produce something. What is being murdered and cut up is the legal report of the Zong case, which fails to do justice to the murdered humans. And here's more about Philip really describing how materially she does it, how she cuts up the text, or as she calls it, murders it. So I'm quoting, I murder the text, literally cut it into pieces, castrating verbs, suffocating adjectives, murdering nouns, throwing articles, prepositions, conjunctions overboard, jettisoning adverbs. I separate subject from verb, verb from object, create semantic mayhem until my hands, bloodied from so much killing and cutting, reach into the stinking, eviscerated innards, and like some seer, sangoma, or prophet who, having sacrificed an animal for signs and portents of new life, or simply life, reads the untold story that tells itself by not telling, unquote. From a sacred perspective, the oxymoron of bone and water fuses two disparate yet complementary funerary practices, the tomb and the wake, the fixed and the performative. The legal transcript is for Philip, the tombstone, the one public marker of the murder of those Africans on board the Zong. It's a public monument, she writes, a textual monument marking their murder and their existence, their small histories that ended so tragically, unquote. The case, with its structured, articulated, and whole frame, is thus the skeleton, the geometric coffin, or the hard grave. But such a fixed, dialectical, and rigid monument is not enough, since the tragic story of these many lost bodies and bones cannot be seized in this immense shipwreck and human wreck. My questions then are, how do we read wreckage? How can we make sense out of a story that cannot be told, yet cannot not be told? How do we maintain memorial, ethical, and sacred imperatives in the shipwreck of language? Is the Zong a linguistic failure? I think not. As Philip claims, the resulting abbreviated, disjunctive, almost nonsensical style of the poem demands a corresponding effort on the part of the reader to make sense of an event that eludes understanding, perhaps permanently, unquote. The first 26 poems of the Zong are for Philip the bones of the poem, while the others are its flesh. Taking a step back to the poems, we begin to make sense of the apparent randomness of somewhat horizontal fragment. Zong number 1 from pages 3 to 4 fills up the entirety of the page with blocks of words and syllables not aligned in any cohesive way. The poem Ferrum, and this is the last page of the poem Ferrum and of the poem per se, from which you see an excerpt, is built as a dense archipelagic zone in which the words become increasingly complex and illegible, with the multiplication of fonts and letter rocks of impenetrable meaning. You can read these as you wish. Ferrum ends, however, with a concrete poem in the form of literal isosceles triangle. The triangle, with its base turned upward, resembles a boat floating above water in equilibrium. The words composing the triangle are proper names written in an elegant, antiquated cursive. The African names, Bektamba, Nuru Okunade, Dolap, Moya, Ade, etc., resurface in the text, but are still locked up in the triangular hold of the slave ship or in the confine of the triangular trade. They dwell in the ambivalent place of rebirth and death of the slave ship, which C.L.R. James and Glissant alike have theorized. While ferrum, the iron, can refer to an instrument of torture, it's also the signature material of Ogun, blacksmith god of war and iron, in the Dahomey, Yoruba, Fon, and ultimately Vodun religion of Haiti. The triangle associated with the title of the book, Ferrum, thus marks a phase of solidity and construction, transformation of metals, of earth and fire. One of the veves or symbols of the loi Ogun Ferraille or Ogu Ferraille in Haitian Vodou has as its base the same triangle, which can also represent an axe blade. Ferrum leaves its readers in the ambivalence between the tortured and the godly, the maimed subject and the maker of iron, the erasure of the past and the poiesis, the making at the heart of poetry. Philip herself, we could interpret, is mounted by the blacksmith Loi Ogun, and thus by the sacred. Like the markings on an aging graves, the letters in Ebora, another section of the Zong, are typed over, turning the poem into, and this is not out of focus, it's just the way it looks in the book, turning the poem into a watercolor palimpsest, an illegible yet undeniable presence, absence, in which inscriptions of different times complete and obscure one another. And here, for instance, there's examples of these words juxtaposed with each other, flowing into each other in a sort of palimpsest or mystery. A sharp sense of urgency surfaces with the multiplication on this page of the word os, which you can trace on several os here and os there and os. So the word os is multiplied along with its anagrammatic offspring SOS, 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 os, save us, os, bone souls, water parts are some of the words that can be made out in this page. So the oxymoron introduced at the beginning of this section, bone water, is repeated in the dissolving of bone in the immaterial soul and the solidifying of water in water parts. Words clashing sometimes give way to happenstance multilingual neologism, such as os mortality and osas. Os mortality collides mortality and bones. Osas derives from the word os and evokes the word rosace with its aesthetic sense of a symmetrical flowery motif on stained glass and its medical sense of the pathology of skin rashes, rosacea, leaving us yet again in this ambivalent place between art and suffering. So to conclude, the cloak of water Unritual tragically reaches planetary dimensions. The drowned of the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, the Atlantic form an underwater nation with the boat people of the Pacific, with East Indians indentured workers forced into an exiling taboo, with the crossing of the Kalapani or Black Waters, and with many other seafarers. Rohingya Muslims from Bangladesh and Myanmar are similarly struggling in the Indonesian seas. Sharply in our consciousness, the lethal abyss of the Caribbean resonates with the Mediterranean. As Martinican writer Patrick Chamoiseau vividly claims, the African continent at the bottom of the Atlantic meets with a stunned exactness its double in the Mediterranean, unquote. The UN reported that in June 2018 alone, and I'm taking this date as I could have chosen many others, unfortunately. The UN reported that in June 2018 alone, 1 out of 7 humans who attempted to cross the Mediterranean lost their lives at sea, a significant increase since 2017, when the percentage, already tragic, was 1 out of 38. The lives lost to the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Atlantic, and the Caribbean Sea tragically resonate with those of African and Middle Eastern asylum seekers or security seekers drowning by the thousands in the underwater cemetery of the Mediterranean and Eastern Atlantic to reach Fortress Europe. Grim circuits are established between the Caribbean Sea and the Mediterranean. After his Caribbean sites, Taylor submerges sculptures in and around Europe. He has some at the bottom of the Thames River in London, in Oslo, most recently in Cannes, and significantly in Lanzarote, a volcanic formation of the Canaries situated 140 kilometers from the Moroccan shores and 1,000 kilometers from Spain. The artist justifies the choice of Lanzarote not only because of its status as a UNESCO biosphere reserve, but also because it is the site of the contemporary human tragedy of African migrants and refugees who have drowned in these waters. The Lanzarote installation is titled Raft of Lampedusa and connects to the political gesture of French painter Géricault's 1819 Raft of Medusa, Le Radeau de la Méduse, which raised consciousness about the incompetence of the ship's captain and the newly restored French monarchy, deemed responsible for the wreck of the frégate Méduse off the coast of Mauritania. Lampedusa, the Italian island situated between Sicilia and Malta, has become a tragic flagship for the unraveling refugee crisis, with the thousands of Africans and Middle Easterners who attempt to reach this outpost of Europe, and specifically for the October 3rd, 2013 wreck of a fishing boat in which 366 clandestine migrants perished. Taylor's, Glissant's, and Phillips' ethical, aesthetic utopias cohabit, co-live with the unconceivable numbers of victims, not merely of the ocean, but also of the walls that attempt to segregate it, as they do humanity. May water, formidable water, rectify this stiffness, this rigor mortis, when it is fully endowed with its sacredness, beauty, and relation. And may art continue to serve as a wake-up call for border enforcing obsessed leaders and nations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you indeed. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions. This was extremely enlightening, and thank you so much for the sharp focus you have put on the myriad ways, in fact, slavery-linked massacres were so deeply and closely connected to present-day deaths in migration. And this is particularly obvious at the end of your book. In fact, this is something that you develop also through Dal Lago's watery graves, particularly, but also, other works. Just to leave a bit of time for people to gather their thoughts and maybe put in their questions in the chat, or if they want to speak. I mean, of course, this is absolutely welcome. Maybe I have, one short and not so short questions. I mean,
Mm.
you make it very clear that it's not only memorializing
Mm-hmm.
that is at stake.
Mm-hmm.
It's also generating new ways and new routes towards creation that would not necessarily remedy anything, but nourish us individually and collectively, and create a kind of common space for all of us to inhabit and share in our present time and space. And what you were saying about the proximity of us and us as well in the text by Philip in Zong is particularly telling in itself. So, you know, you have showed, I mean, in your talk, and you do so in your book as well, you have showed that the stuttering and the groaning and the whispering that is, you know, that are involved in the reading of Zong also enables us, actually, also enables us to perform a new form of poesis, a new form of art making, and more generally, a new form of performing. So how do you, so of course the unmarked, you know, water graves are sites of, you know, loss and haunting, and art cannot undo the trauma and the damage that has been done. But your book hinges on the possibility that literature and artworks are also going to be sites of creation, not only recreation, but creation and connection that could offer some form of remedy, some form of healing, and this common space, you know, to inhabit and share. So how do we deal with the tension, this tension between a story that cannot be told and cannot not be told, as you were saying, and as Philip also says in Zong.
Yeah.
And how do you account for the fact that multimedia, intermedial, transmedial works of art seem to be better equipped to deal with the impossible task of telling through untelling? Apologies for the long question.
No, these are, thank you, Judith. These are really excellent questions. And I'm glad you emphasized the fact that it's not just about memorializing. It's not about just a gesture of the present, you know, looking backwards to the past, but it's also very much in the present. And I think that's why I put so much emphasis on performativity. It's not something fixed or stable, but it's something that continues in the present, in the future, and sometimes without us and without the agency of artists and writers. So this continuity into the present and future is central. And I didn't read us in us, but I could have. So thank you. I was thinking about us and eau, les os ou les eaux, bones or waters in French, but us and us, I think is a good way to emphasize the importance of a community, of a communal, which is in question. What community are these artists addressing, from Philip to Jason deCaires Taylor to Glissant? I mean, if we take Glissant in the open boat, there's at least two levels or two imbricated forms of communities that is expressed by the we. There is, you know, we the Africans, we the descendants, which addresses a specific targeted community. And in the open boat, the descendant becomes everyone, right? So there's a community of descendants of enslaved Africans, which concerns everyone. If we think of Nourbese Philip, she also, of course, refers to the descendants of Africans and memorializing captured and murdered Africans. But there's also in her notanda particularly a lot of references to other events of similar scale, such as the Shoah. That's also really an important reference for Philip. And if you think of Jason deCaires Taylor, that's an interesting point as well, because his primary and initial goal was ecological. He started building these underwater museums and putting his statues underwater with the ecological purpose of providing structures for coral reefs and other forms of life to reappear. And there was this circle of humans holding hands that I showed you as one of the slides. This is vicissitudes, which was at first on social media read as a memorialization of the drowned of the Middle Passage. But then some critics intervened and said, Jason deCaires Taylor never thought about the Middle Passage. It's just a coincidence. So there's a bit of a controversy about this. And what I argued in the book is that, the site itself, the site of drowning these anthropomorphic sculptures at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, the site itself is a co-creator of that community. It cannot not refer to that community as well. And it's interesting that, Jason deCaires Taylor, whose goal in his first installations was ecological, is now tied to a concern for the murder or the death of humans attempting to cross the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean. So his installation in the site of Lanzarote, and it's interesting because it's in Lanzarote in the Canary Island in the Atlantic, but then the installation is called the Raft of Lampedusa. So there's these two spaces of that are both symbolic of loss of a human catastrophe that has become. I mean, he became not able not to also speak to that. So there's it's an interesting evolution in the artist's work. And then your question about multimedia and intermedial and transmedial, absolutely. I'm a literary scholar. I was trained in poetry. I was trained in reading fiction and poetry mostly. And when I started I worked on food too, so I learned to read that medium too. But when I started my work, the book Water Graves really happened or started happening after Hurricane Katrina and all the human disaster associated with it happened in 2005. I used to live in Louisiana, so this is something that hit me personally. And I realized while meeting, first of all, I realized I could not work on poetry alone, and that there was so much going on in mixed media art and in photography that I couldn't really do without in the book. So I started, I started working on mixed media installations, underwater sculptures, and also intermedial installations that use both, sounds and material objects. But by talking to these artists who practiced art in New Orleans, and who, for the ones I worked on, lost a lot of their belongings in Hurricane Katrina, they could never create art the same way. So let's say someone who was photographing, jazz musicians in New Orleans, very pretty black and white pictures, did not do, had to move to multi, and this is Eric Water, could not just choose one media, but had to work with clarinets and sounds and jazz. And I think that's, that's really connected, Judith, to the, the bind of that we are in of a story that is not able to be told yet, cannot not be told. And of course, this is not new, and it's I'm thinking of Blanchot, for instance, in Discourse of the Disaster makes a similar similar argument. So this is not new, but I think that multimedia and also collaboration between artists also speaks to that impossibility of telling in one medium.
Yes, and it's interesting to note as well that Zong in itself is transmedial, and it includes, you can think of, it's performance, it's sculpture, it's visuals. It's not only text as text, obviously. So
obviously, and this is just the beginning of Zong. Nourbese Philip has on, you can find them on YouTube, various oral renderings of her poem Zong, and it appears completely different. Sometimes the line that separates the poem and the name of the drowned completely disappears in the oral rendering. Silences are read differently in each occurrence. So this is really in turn like the Gregson versus Gilbert case. This is in turn the beginning, the body, the bones that needs to be recreated each time there's a new rendering of it.
Thank you. So there are questions that have started coming in the chat. Francesca, would you like to in fact sum up your question orally? Do you want to put your mic on, or would you rather Valérie
happy to
in the chat?
I'm actually second generation Chilean exile, which is partly where this question comes from. But it just really struck me that the words that you had on your opening slide were exactly the same words that are spoken by protagonist in Nostalgia for the Light by Patricia Guzman. And she has spent decades looking for her husband's bones in the Atacama Desert. And it just, throughout your talk, just more and more thoughts kind of were occurring around, the desert as an elemental a space where the elements are kind of bordering, really. And she speaks of how, the high salt content of the desert, because it, obviously follows the whole line of Pacific, so it always has these sea fogs coming in, means that any bones that are found, it's pretty much impossible to identify any DNA in it. Either way, what bones there are utterly fragmented from the constant erosion of the salt winds. So identification is really difficult. So that's one of the things that I was kind of interested, if you could potentially speak a little bit more about where the sea and the land potentially cross over, but also if you've seen this, or The Pearl Button, which is the second part of the trilogy.
So
yes, Guzman has a very poetic approach to talking about this, as do the interviewees, and how there are parallels between the written form and the filmic form here.
Right. No, I haven't seen it, but I will watch it. I will watch it now. But the questions that you raise are really really fascinating, and this started occupying me. Especially the question of the desert has started occupying me when I was finishing up the book. I see my friend and colleague Naima Hashad here in the audience, but towards the end of the book, she sent me a variety of works of arts by artists from Morocco and Libya, and also pointed out to me the fact that sea crossers, before crossing the sea, also often cross the desert. So there's first of all this continuity between deserts and the crossing of the Sahara and the crossing of the Mediterranean, which is unified by the same passage of refugees and migrants. And there's also something to be done, I think, about the materiality of the desert and sand, which brings about, Philip creates the word ex aqua, but what would it mean to retrieve bones from the sand and the Sahara? It's I think there's also a loss for language here, and I'm thinking of this obsession for bones, whether they're interred in mass graves or immersed in water, or altered by sand, is I think a universal obsession, especially, in the loss of everybody, but especially in the loss of collective death. I'm thinking also of the Algerian writer Tahar Jaoud, Les chercheurs d'eau, Les chercheurs d'os, where the main character is looking for his brother's bones in the sand. So they would be, I think this opens up some really interesting avenue, and it would be interesting to see what happens to aesthetic forms of art when they are shaped by sand and not water. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. Comments.
Claudine, there was a question from Claudine, one of my colleagues, about Valérie, le cimetière marin.
Bonjour Claudine.
Yeah. Bonjour. Je suis vraiment ravie de t'entendre. Okay. I'm going to switch to English because I think a lot of people might not speak French. Now, I just thought about the cimetière marin. It's a very long poem and a very complex one, but I thought that somehow it's the antinomy, if you want, of what you were describing. Mm-hmm. Although, I suppose he ponders about the fact that the graves in the cimetière marin are empty. The bones are not there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, so
there's a geographical tropism, if I can say that, because I just was in Sète the other day, and you know that the name of our university is Paul Valéry, so this is also why I thought about le cimetière marin. It could be interesting to think about the fact that they had to build a cimetière marin in Sète, so I don't know if there are many others, you see, as opposed to what you're describing, which is at a loss and an attempt to memorialize. So that is somewhere somewhat in between somehow.
Right. So it's interesting, and it's also funny that you mentioned Paul Valéry's grave in Sète, in that beautiful cemetery in Sète. I was just thinking about that cemetery because I rediscovered Brassens' song, his plea to be interred in the Sète. Anyway, I've been thinking this song a lot. So yeah, and actually one day I was looking for the grave of Paul Valéry in Sète, and I didn't find it, but I did find Georges Brassens' very peaceful grave site, and actually had a picnic there with another professor who was visiting at Montpellier at the time. So but anyway, yes, I did consider Paul Valéry's cimetière marin of course, but I think you're right that it's, you know, it's about construction. It's about and it's a little bit antithetical, because the cimetière marin is by the sea, but not submerged in the sea, even though it could eventually. And I think there would be a lot of parallels to draw between Paul Valéry's grave and poem and Glissant, Édouard Glissant's grave in Le Diamant, Martinique, who was very much inspired by Paul Valéry's Cimetière Marin, and who had also his grave.
My other comment, which I didn't put in the chat, Valérie, would be, since I know you know Toni Morrison fairly well, somehow I see Philip as in a lineage, if you want, and even a lineage from, let's say, Song of Solomon, where you do have bones, a bag of bones, and you know, those are very prominent, down to, I suppose, Beloved, which is, you know, this fully clothed woman walked, you know, she walked out of the water. And so it seems that Morrison somehow, you know, these texts could be stepping stones, if I can say that, to, I mean, poetic stepping stones towards what you're doing and towards what Philip is doing in terms of the imaginary, you know, of the Middle Passage and of the water. The Beloved passage at in the middle, you know, is, to me, seems to be a pretext, a text that comes before what you have just shown us in Zong in many ways. So I don't know if you know, if you want to comment on that, if you think the lineage is appropriate, with the departure, obviously, would be something much more radical than Morrison.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really a kinship between Philip and Morrison, and yeah, it's hard not to think about Pilate in Song of Solomon's carrying her father's bones, I think, in her.
Yes, she thinks the bones are, you know, the white man, that Milkman Macon as killed, but in fact the bones are her father's and of their fathers, and in fact they bury the bones, you see, as opposed to what you're describing, which is an impossibility of finding the bones, of burying the bones.
Yeah,
but then you have Beloved, I think, sort of plays with this idea, I mean, with what you've just described. So to me, when I see what you give us, you know, as examples from Philip, to me, it's a much more radical departure, still with links, obviously, to, you know, these, you know, let's say the text that comes before, you know, I mean, Gates would say it signifies on, you know, I don't think it's so easy to say that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But again, I think that what makes the bones is in Zong so particular is that they are underwater, and this develops certain properties in the poem and in the method of the text. But yeah, I think it would be, I mean, I think it would be crucial to look at. And Tanya Shields, an author I quoted in my presentation in her text, Bodies and Bones, does a more systematic analysis of bones in the production of descendants of the African diaspora in the Caribbean and in the US. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to search into this parentage of bones. I also just want to say that bones, I mean, I chose bones today for this talk, and I kind of compiled several sections of the book. So bones was one of the concerns that I had in the book, but was not as central as, you know, bones in Tanya Shields, Bodies and Bones, for instance. But yeah, I think
maybe we could switch to maybe one last question, because I'm keeping an eye on the watch. I know you have an engagement as well afterwards, Valérie. But there is a question from Marwa. Marwa, would you like to put your mic on?
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I don't know, it's morning at some places, evening elsewhere. So hi, everyone. Yeah, so thank you very much for this outstanding presentation. So I'm actually a PhD student and working on Zong under Dr. Misrahi Barak. So I was totally interested with this presentation. My question, I'll make it quickly. So the poem itself is very complicated to be understood, and she herself decided to do this periodical reading for everyone, which are available on YouTube, to help people really grasp the words and to give them really the aspects of the journey of slavery. So she really breaks the boundaries of the language in general through establishing her own poetry. And because she believed that the legal document was really silencing this truth, and her poem is a kind of response to the truth that was neglected. And of course, they consider it, so those slaves, as goods. So my question was related. I think I heard that you mentioned that her poem complements the legal document, and I was wondering if you consider her poem as really a complement. I mean, she complements this legal document, or more she tries to respond back to it, or deconstruct what has been told by really creating her own new truth through a very deconstructed and fragmented language.
Yeah, thank you for these comments. Are you at Paul Valérie?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for these comments. They're really helpful, and I think you're right to question the term complement. I think I use the term complement to refer to the structure of the Zong and to the different parts where the acknowledgements complement the poems, which complement the glossary, which complement the case. I was more talking about the internal structure of the text. I don't see the Zong as a complement to the case. I think it's a radical, I mean, you know, considering the Zong as a complement would be putting the Zong, the Gregson versus Gilbert case as originary, and I really don't want to do that. I think that one of the I mean, the bones of the text are what remain in this violent archive. But yeah, the term to complement is not enough. So I would say, yeah, as she says, murder, deconstruct, reassemble, insufflate life and reverence, you know, because by choosing a co-author who's a departed person and placing it on the spine of the book, Philippe and Botong, as a co-author, she's really doing something more than just responding to history, but she's speaking and writing and reading with the ancestors. So yeah, I don't think complementing with is a proper term of describing this all. But it's great to hear you're working on it. And yeah, I would encourage everyone to listen to the YouTube videos. We were lucky to have Nourbese Philippe at Emory last year, I think, and it was quite special to have her. And she had a ceremonial. She gave us pieces of fabric, which would be the linceul or the shroud, pieces of the shrouds. So it's not just writing, it's not just oral, but it's also sharing, you know, material pieces.
There was a lovely talk as well, organized by Alisa Trotz, as well as part of this, you know, performing series. So that was also very good. I think we'll have to, you know, wrap up, because I'm you know, keeping an eye on the watch as well. So I want to thank you again. I mean, it's been really enlightening talk. So thank you so much. There were lot of comments in the chat as well. And I also wanted to mention that you are a project, team member, so you're part of this Thanatic ethics project, which is, focused on migration and circulation of bodies, dead bodies in migratory context. So this is our, focus. So there will be an event, another online event that will happen on the 1st and the 2nd of April. Please get on, if you want to hear back from us directly, write to us if you still need to be put on a mailing list. It will be mentioned posted on websites as well. And there will be another physical flesh and blood event on campus at Paul Valérie at EMA, and so probably happening in the very last few days in September. We haven't circulated. There will be a call for papers, an open call for papers that will be circulated for that event. So please be on the lookout, and we'll be back in touch with you about that. And I'm sure either Thomas or Bidisha, you want to say something in conclusion, maybe about the ways people can access the videos of the webinars as well. Thank you again, Valérie, and we'll certainly be in touch.
Judith and Bidisha and Thomas for this invitation. It was great to be with you here today, this morning. And I hope the chat will be safe, because there's some interesting questions on there. So is the chat going to be saved?
I'll save it. Yeah,
Oh,
I'll make sure it's saved. Yeah. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the talk. It was
great
fantastic.
meeting you and seeing some of you virtually. Merci.
Bidisha, you want to say something about the video?
Yeah,
or Thomas?
I've just put the link there in the chat box. That's where we're uploading all our videos after just editing them a little bit. So you can watch that space, and we'll be uploading the recording of today's talk as well soon. So
yeah. And in 1 month time, on the 12th of March, 12th of March, we got our next webinar will be by Félicien de Huche from the University of Liège, and he will talk about the transnational engagement around Senegalese migrant death. Right, so it's a continuity of the previous one we had on the Tajik, so how the migrants take care of their dead.
And in fact, what is at the focus of these, webinars and sessions and projects? I mean, it's how the community of the dead inform and give cohesion and togetherness to the community of the living, of course. So it's this tension, in fact, that is part of our hypothesis. Yeah, so thank you again. Bye, everyone, and we'll see each other soon.
thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.